What I would like to focus on in our contribution from Inclusion Europe is the particular element of ending segregation of people with intellectual disabilities, because there can be no talk about independent living if there are still people being institutionalized and segregated. So that's one part of that big topic. Of course, closing down the harmful places, segregated institutions. And what I especially want to focus on is one element of that process, which is very often neglected. That for us, independent living and being included is essentially being able to live in your own place, having friends, making your own choices, and being good at something. In a sense, it's all about belonging. And to achieve that, to support every person leaving an institution, they need support specifically in establishing a new life, not just to move out, but to establish social relations and to overcome the repercussions of the trauma caused by institutionalization. And we often see that this particular element is being neglected and overlooked. Most of the focus usually, especially when funding is involved, investment funding is involved, the focus is on building houses. And also in terms of supporting people or evaluating their support needs, usually the focus is on kind of household related skills and abilities. This needs to change. It needs to shift to supporting people to establish a new life in terms of having social roles and relations, and supporting them to establish these and to gain skills and competences in this area, because that, of course, people who were in institutions for a very, very long time especially don't have. Preceding that as well, as we need to highlight that people with complex support needs, especially alongside with people with intellectual disabilities in general, but people with complex support needs especially are often left out of the institutionalization efforts, and it needs again to completely change. Every DI effort must start with setting up support for people with complex support. There can be no cherry picking people so-called suitable to live independently or having the skills to live independently. And of course, it's important to try and support the people in a person-centered collaborative way. It's also important to broaden their scope of possibilities and experiences and expectations. And with the practices I'll come to in a minute, that's what I'm trying to highlight here from various countries. Mostly on a smaller scale, I also try to look at how these are being done at a larger scale, because that's of course the biggest challenge. How it's one thing to have a lot of examples of well-functioning support services or well-functioning mainstream services or any other thing. Another thing is to scale these things so everybody can benefit from them. So having said that, I'll get into two practices and then two more that do it at a larger scale. As I said, this is all about focusing on the person's social relations, establishing their life outside of the institution, and focusing on the social aspect of the situation, not on the person's skills to take care of their hygiene or take care of the household, doing the household chores, but it's about establishing social roles and social interactions and competences and relations. So one, and first, like to kind of use the term housing first in this case. It's an example from Romania, one of self-advocates that we worked in very closely, involved in who herself spent 20 years in an institution, and now with an organization they work and get people out of institutions. They find rented flat or other housing, and they help people move there. So that's one example worth following. Of course, the challenge, of course, is these are done on very small scale. But what is important in this particular case is the focus on having the house or the place to live and building on the experience of people who went through institutionalization themselves and who went through the process and experience of moving out of an institution, and using that experience to help others and to support them in moving out. On a kind of similar, larger scale, but in this case more driven by professional approach, less the self-advocacy part, or less on the experience, is a case from Czechia, where two organizations here actually mentioned. One of them works across the country supporting people in restoring their legal capacity and helping them in that way move out of institutions. And the other that this is specifically about essentially uses a job-first approach. When they find job employment for the person with disabilities, and they use that to establish kind of the other elements of life outside of the institution. So find appropriate housing, help support the person to move, to establish their new life, and to be successful, keeping that job, and of course keeping and maintaining the new job outside of an institution. In this case, it was over 60 people in a number of years. I said, first one is kind of more of like housing first, find a place to live in and support the person to do it. The other is maybe more like job first. Both of these have one thing in common, or two. It's not based on building anything and focused on building houses. It's focused on the individual and supporting them in individualist manner. And the second thing they have in common, the support is designed and based on social roles and establishing the new life based on social roles and functioning in the new world, essentially. There, of course, comes the biggest challenge, which is doing all this at scale. One of the so here I would go to an example from Scotland. Our member organization in this case, which provides their care and support on their what they call a personal assistance model, essentially to simplify, taking away the administrative elements of personal assistance and keeping the person's decisions, demands, expectations, selecting the person who will be providing care, organizing the care. That's with the person who needs the support, and they are in this case functioning all over Scotland with a very successful model that also receives the highest scores in the quality evaluations. And I'm especially picking this as an example how person-centered support can be done at a large scale, which is something that I think we should be looking here especially with. And another one is a recent closure on an institution that was established and run by the city of Prague in Czechia. It was 116 people in some woods in central Bohemia. And all of these people moved out in 2 years, which is a record time in Czech context. It involved no construction of new houses. Part of the people moved out into the region nearby because that's what they wanted. They wanted to stay in the area, but moved into a bigger town and found apartments and flats to live there. Another part moved to Prague, again into apartments and flats rented or provided by the city of Prague, and with the support of outreach services. And why this is relevant and compared to many other larger activities of closing institutions in Central and Eastern Europe is, again, there was no constructions of houses involved, And the whole process was very much based on supported decision making and establishing individually what the person expects, what the person wants, and respecting those wishes. So just wanted to highlight what I think from perspective of people with intellectual disabilities often missing in the conversation about especially deinstitutionalization and closing down institutions. And that is essentially the fact that focus must be on establishing and restoring their social roles and social relations, because independent living is essentially about having a plan, their own place, having friends, making choices, and being good at something. Of course, the challenge is then to scale this area for many more people to benefit from. So I think it is essential these things are taken into consideration, given that people with intellectual disability, and especially people with complex support needs, tend to be overlooked when it comes to the institutionalization efforts across the EU. Thank you. One thing that I definitely need to add to it, that one of the biggest problems with not the kind of approach specifically, but what it's connected to it, because it's done largely by NGOs, it's often not followed by actions on the side of authorities. So when I, for example, say that 63 people, in that case in Czechia, were moved out of institutions, those places were again, the people were again replaced with new people going into institutions. So that's one big thing why what is very problematic, not with the approach itself, but it's not followed by actions on the side of the service institutional care providers or relevant authorities to reduce the number of people going into institutions. These, and I said already, these are kind of a small scale scenarios, but they are very useful in the sense that they do exactly what we believe is needed to do in the institutionalization. That's what we need to be looking at. Very much about also the incentives. So if there are money going towards building things, people, authorities will build things. And if they are building things, houses for where to provide services, they will inevitably do that, focus most of their energy on. So the answer to scaling these things, I think, would be to provide much more direct funding and support to approaches like this. I'm not saying that's the only one. Obviously, there will be many others like this. But to help them scale and kind of reduce the focus on bricks and mortar.